Hi, and welcome to the 6th episode of NXIVM on Trial. I'm Times Union Managing Editor Casey Seiler, and this is the 5th week in the trial of Keith Raniere, the man known within the shadowy organization NXIVM as Vanguard. He is on trial in U.S. District Court in Brooklyn, facing a variety of federal charges. He is the only remaining defendant out of a half dozen high leaders of NXIVM who faced felony charges. All but him have pleaded guilty. We are going to hear in just a little bit an interview I conducted earlier this week with Rob Gavin, who, as I record this, is in the courtroom on Friday afternoon listening to what so far today has been fairly harrowing testimony. But we want to offer an update on exactly what happened this week in trial, which was a short week, just running Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The 5th week began with an FBI agent's introduction of hundreds of messages, text messages traded between Keith Raniere and a young woman, one of his many lovers within the organization, or perhaps I should say sexual partners, considering the level of emotional cruelty and domination by Raniere that has been the subject of much of the testimony so far. These text messages included references to when their relationship began that suggests that it became sexual when the young woman was 15. And that comports with testimony that we heard from this young woman's older sister, a Mexican national, whose testimony, including her account of almost 2 years of captivity within a row house bedroom up in Halfmoon, occupied all or almost all of last week's court time. The young woman whose messages were introduced on Wednesday and Thursday did not appear in court. She has not been called as a witness, but she is the subject of many of the charges that Raniere is facing. On Thursday, the day began with testimony from an expert witness who spoke about the mechanisms of sexual domination and emotional control, aspects of which have been echoed in much of the testimony we have heard from many of the women who were part of NXIVM. The court then began to hear testimony that continued into Friday from a 31-year-old actress who described her initiation into DOS, the Master Slave Club within NXIVM. She was recruited into that group by Allison Mack, the Smallville actress, who, along with Keith Raniere, were allegedly the leaders of that club. Allison Mack told the woman, according to her testimony, that it was a sorority of sorts and a, quote, really cool thing. On Friday, however, the woman's testimony darkened considerably, in which she described her initiation into the group after what might be referred to as kind of a grooming period by Mack and Raniere. One night near the end of March 2016, she was taken in by Raniere, blindfolded, undressed, transported, redressed, and then transported to a second location where she was strapped to a table, undressed again, and had someone perform oral sex on her. She thought that it was Raniere performing oral sex on her, according to her testimony, until she heard Raniere talking to her, walking around the table that she was blindfolded and strapped to, asking her intimate questions, at which point she realized there was a third person in the room, an individual whose name she never knew, but according to prosecutors was, in fact, the young woman whose text messages to Raniere had been introduced at trial earlier in the week. As I said, this is mid-afternoon on Friday. This testimony is ongoing. You can read all of this on the Times Union, on timesunion.com. All of our stories about the NXIVM trial and the paper's many years of investigation into NXIVM can be found there. And with that, we will hand things over to Rob Gavin in a conversation recorded on Monday. Rob, we're talking Monday, June 3rd. You are now just less than 24 hours away from getting back on the train and heading back down. How did you spend this day back in the capital region?
Well, having covered NXIVM and having been NXIVM focused and having some time off, I decided to spend the day up at Knox Woods, the center of the NXIVM universe.
NXIVM neighborhood.
This is the area. If you're not sure where it is in the general vicinity of what is now known as Crescent Commons. Behind the very well-respected, unrelated to NXIVM location of Fred the Butcher. And then you do have what was a NXIVM-related location of Apropos. Well, if you make a right turn...
Which is sort of a restaurant meeting space.
Correct.
That has cropped up in a number of witnesses' testimony.
Yeah, if you make a right turn right where Apropos is on 236, and you go down that road, you will eventually come to... You're going to pass an intersection, and you go down a little bit further, and you're going to pass... eventually come to Knox Woods, which is a right turn.
Yeah.
And when you go into Knox Woods, it's sort of a townhouse development.
It is, I mean, for our listeners who are sort of around the country who are unfamiliar, this is in a portion of the capital region that is basically just south of Saratoga. It is the most suburban, spanking new. I think none of these developments are more than 20 years old.
Probably not. It's very suburban.
It is just as generic and vanilla as you can conjure up. And the idea that behind this very staid, very Dullsville suburban townhouse complex, everything that we've been hearing about is going on is just really mind-boggling. So you were basically walking the ground.
Correct.
Where a lot of the NXIVM faithful, or at least some of the NXIVM faithful, are, from what we've heard, still residing.
Yeah, and there's definitely fear that they're still there. When you pull in,
residents who are not
definitely. When you pull into Knox Woods, this is kind of interesting. There's a sign that says, "Report any suspicious activity to the Saratoga County Sheriff's Department."
But it's just your standard.
It's your standard crime scene,
yeah.
And in most of these little communities,
but
that's
your standard Crime Stoppers.
Correct.
Message, right?
Yeah, you figure, a burglary, someone who's stealing something off property. You don't usually think it's going to involve master-slave, alleged sex groups, in which this case is based on.
We so rarely do.
Yeah.
So you spoke to people up there.
Definitely.
And they basically are. Did they have any idea this was going on? They clearly knew that NXIVM had a presence there, but they've been probably just as shocked as a lot of people.
Very shocked. There was not a single person, and I spoke to more than half a dozen people up there. Not a single person wanted to give their name. And many people were very familiar with NXIVM and Keith Raniere. They said that Keith Raniere walked around a lot. One person told me he walked around with women who looked like models. And very interesting story, one resident told me they were all very afraid of the surveillance. It sort of upset people that there was so much surveillance in the neighborhood on the residence of NXIVM members. They knew they had cameras up there. One guy up there says to me, yet another person who didn't want me to report his name, and he said, hey, he approached Keith Raniere once and said, hey, Keith, we think somebody stole some packages out from in front of my neighbor's house. Do you think we could get a chance and look at your surveillance cameras so we can find out who did this? And Raniere apparently told him, hey, maybe we can do that. Let me go talk to Nancy. And meanwhile, this guy...
Meaning
Nancy Salzman, absolutely.
President of NXIVM.
And he never got back to him on that. But it was just kind of funny that he was so well known that you could go up to him and say, hey, Keith, hey, you guys have the surveillance. Definitely people in the complex who were... When you mention the subject, they say, oh, yeah, no, we're aware of them. They've been here for a long time. They sort of kept to themselves. But that being said, there was a lot of people in sort of disbelief about what had happened on Wilton Court with the young woman who was confined, she says, against her will to a room for almost 2 years.
This is a Mexican national whose testimony really took up the bulk of last
Correct.
week.
She's 33 now, and she's off the stand. People were sort of like, well, hey, if I knew that was going on, I would have said something. And not to give away the address of where it is, but the location of many of the homes on Wilton Court, you're facing woods in the back of this. So it's sort of the desperation or the how upset this would be. Keep in mind, if you're looking out the window and all you see is just woods, a number of homes in that area had words like "Home Sweet Home" on them. I mean, this is really cookie cutter suburbia.
Yeah, right.
Home Sweet Home, welcome spring, all these flowers. It's a tree lined development, and meanwhile you have talk of unlawful imprisonment and a lot of other allegedly nefarious activities.
You think you discovered Allison Mack's BMW?
I do believe I saw what at least one worker there identified as Allison Mack's blue BMW, and to be completely honest, I saw what looked like a luxury car parked in that same area, and I said, "Oh wow, this must be it." And I took a picture, and then realized that was a Chrysler, and that was the wrong car. And the homeowner, the person who owned the car, said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm sorry, I thought you owned Allison Mack's BMW." And the woman was actually very happy that I mistook her car for a BMW. But within a few,
this podcast brought to you by Chrysler.
Yeah, and I did eventually see it. There was a lot of pollen dust on it, and I asked a few workers there, and they said, "Yeah, that's been there for a while." And I said, "Is that Allison Mack's BMW?" He said, "Yes." And a number of people in that Grenadier Court area seemed to know about this car having been there for a while. They seemed to be aware that Allison Mack's car had been there. She had apparently driven it around, and a lot of people said that she had lived in an apartment on Grenadier Court, which was later, the address was officially, I think, the address of a Nikki Klein, who was another actress and involved in NXIVM. But across and around NXIVM, there was the Knox Woods. There is this interesting situation where you have the people who've lived there,
right?
And it's not like sometimes when you cover a story like this, people will say, "Oh, that's just a small part of the complex. Oh, that doesn't speak for all of us." Pretty much everybody I spoke to was like, "No, they're all around here. They were everywhere. They were fully acknowledging that they were all over there." And I don't know that too many people seem particularly happy about it. I think they were. One person had told me about seeing a lot of people had actually talked about parking spaces, that they would see all these parking spaces filled up. And while the parking spaces are filled up, they'd have to say, "Hey, we're only allowed 2 spots." And there's out-of-state plates, and there'd be 20 people in this one gathering, and they would be NXIVM people. One woman told me that she saw a member of NXIVM try to recruit a young woman into NXIVM. She heard the conversation, and she believed the woman had sold this prospective member on NXIVM by the end of the conversation. So it's just interesting to walk around, to see this area, particularly on a warm day. You see the pools open. It looks like the perfect place for a young family or anyone else to live. And meanwhile, you have this is the setting of racketeering and other underlying acts.
It doesn't look like the Bates Motel.
It does not. This does not. This would not be what you would think of. I don't know what you think of with it when you think of a cult, allegedly, which people use that term. Critics of NXIVM have used that term. This is not what you think about. This is the epitome of cookie cutter suburbia.
This summer is the 10th anniversary of a period in New York's history that most state lawmakers and political insiders wish they could forget. The plot that unfolded at the Capitol was stranger than fiction and featured a cast of characters destined for jail cells. From the Times-Union, it's the Capitol Confidential podcast's Tales from the Coup series. Listen now and subscribe wherever you download podcasts.
So, switching from cookie cutter suburbia to the wilds of Brooklyn, I want to ask you just a couple of questions about what it's like covering this trial. What is the media scene like? Where are the reporters coming from?
All over. We have the typical reporters that cover the Eastern District of New York, such as the New York Times, Daily News, New York Post, as well as Courthouse News. But there's a bunch of other outlets there. Obviously, we are there as the Times-Union. You have a reporter from Vice in Vancouver. There have been 2 documentary crews that have been there for much, if not all, the testimony. One working on a project for HBO, another on a project for Stars. There's been reporters there from Mexico. There's been reporters there from Rolling Stone. There have been reporters there from all different outlets, including I talked to one person who had been there. I can't think of the name of the organization, but I mean, a lot of different reporters from all over the world. And here's the thing: if you don't get there early enough, it's almost like showing up first come first serve. If you don't get there early enough, there's a chance you're not going to be able to sit in court, because the courtroom has been so popular with not just reporters but also lawyers, observers, that there's a line outside the courthouse. So typically what will happen is the reporters who cover the Eastern District or the Southern District have exceptions where they are allowed to carry their cell phones in court. Not to record, not to tweet per se. They do tweet a lot, but just to basically have access to their phones. Mm-hmm. That is not the case in this trial. Nobody is allowed in with a phone. And in fact, to get into this courtroom, you have to go through 2 metal detectors. The first one outside coming in, and then there's a second one you have to come in. So what happens is I'm actually very often like just getting ready to I'm going to take off my belt because I know I'm going to have to take it off again. But there's been, we've had every single day, we have seen, among other observers in there, Barbara Boucher, a former senior proctor, was her official position in NXIVM.
Broke from NXIVM more than a decade.
Yeah, she was part of the NXIVM 9 or around that time in 2009. We've seen Tony Natale, who was a former longtime girlfriend of Keith Raniere. She's been there every day. We've seen other members of NXIVM, including Joe O'Hara, who is, if you remember, he was associated with NXIVM as an attorney. And at one point, he's in the courtroom in the back, and he's referred to on the witness stand as the witness. The young woman from Mexico refers to him as someone who looked like Santa Claus. So I did turn around and say, give him a look like, Joey, are you hearing this? You're being referred to here. And there is sort of that kind of bizarre situation where you have people referred to in court and they're in the courtroom. Certainly Barbara Boucher has been mentioned any number of times.
I assume the fact that Barbara Boucher and Joe O'Hara are observing in the courtroom means that they're probably not going to be called. They're definitely not going to be called. They're not going to be called.
The fact that you're in court, with the exception of, say, FBI agents, and the government will very often allow FBI agents to sit with the government and have those agents testify even when they're not actually, even though they're going to testify. Other witnesses are not allowed to do that. So no, I don't think you'll see. Actually, you're not going to see Barbara Boucher or Joe O'Hara. And the early word. See, we don't know everybody the government's going to call or not call, but the early word is that we're not going to see some of the bigger names we thought we might see, such as. I don't think there's any indication that we're going to see Sarah Edmondson. Mm-hmm. But
she's an actress, part of the Vancouver crew.
Yes.
She was a member of DOS. And
very publicly was interviewed in the New York Times article, and I believe we've spoken to her as well as someone, her experience as being branded within DOS, that's the Master Slave Group, which is one of many. And one of the things we realize is that there's so many little groups within NXIVM. We have a tendency to think of NXIVM as this NXIVM, and there's a lot of little groups that were in there, and every one of them, when you listen to the prosecution, every one of these groups had that same pyramid structure. Let's have one person add 6, add 12, just continue to add people, and at every one of those pyramids, Keith Raniere is at the top.
Describe, if you will, what Raniere's demeanor has been throughout this. I'm sure it ebbs and flows for different witnesses, but what's been most notable about the way he's been conducting himself in court?
During the testimony of the woman, the Mexican woman who was in the room, Raniere appeared to be hanging on every word she said. He would put his hand on his chin under his hand, and he'd move up. He would seem, and I think, oh wow, he's really getting into it.
Literally on the edge of his seat.
He was on the edge of his seat. He'd focus. He would be, one person I talked to used the term glaring. They said he was glaring at her. And for a brief period of time, he was doing that during the testimony of Lawrence Salzman as well. But the testimony of this woman, he really seemed fixated on it. There are times when he is writing. He did seem a little uncomfortable when there was almost a comical part. Not that there's not that it's a comical case, but the part where she was talking about the first experience she has with him. It's the first sexual experience she has with him, where basically she says that he tries to have sex with her, and she's like, well, he claimed they had intercourse, and she's like, no, I didn't feel anything. Which, the tabloids had a field day with this because it's
suggesting that he might have some kind of erectile dysfunction.
Correct. And they really had a field day with that. While that testimony happened, Raniere was looking down, scribbling notes. He was not fixated on her at that point. And it's one of the things that's interesting. You have this guy who's been made out to this larger than life figure, and you hear his voice on the tapes. You hear his voice throughout recordings on the trial. And then you look over at him, and here's this guy wearing, every day he's worn a sweater over a dress shirt. And it's just kind of funny. He's not particularly a large guy. He doesn't have, it's funny, on one of the recordings, the woman had talked about the woman who I just mentioned, the Mexican woman who was confined in the room. He makes a comment to her about having a large head. And in court, you look at him; he does have kind of a large head. He's not a big guy, but he does have a large, kind of large,
kind of a fire plug.
He really does. And but he has been. He gave notes during one of their testimony of one witness on Friday, where he would scribble notes and he'd hand it to Tenny Garagos, who's one of his defense attorneys, to give to Mark Agnifilo. He seemed to really want to be on top of questions that are going to be asked of witnesses during cross-examination. And for the most part, the cross-examinations have all been done by Mark Agnifilo, his main attorney.
And very quickly, because we're running out of time, have any of those cross-examinations blown any kind of major holes in the credibility of the individual witnesses or the overall government case so far? And once again, I hesitate to say this, we're only 4 weeks into this trial now, but it has not been going well for Keith Raniere.
It doesn't seem that. It doesn't seem. I think you could make the case many of the cross-examinations have backfired, depending on the questions asked. Definitely with Lauren Salzman, there's been a chance where he's opened the door to something, and then she would certainly respond with a very long answer, and I think, many times she would mention something else which was not favorable to Keith Raniere. The only thing you can make the case that probably may have helped him a little bit, but I still don't think it was much, is the fact that this woman had been a thief, that she had stolen the Mexican national. But again, she came here when she was 16, and the government got ahead of it. They mentioned this stuff beforehand. He is, in his opening statement, he made the comment that he had an uphill battle. I think we're going to probably see more of an effort by the defense to try to focus on the personal responsibility. He mentioned that in his opening, the fact that I think he could try to make the case that, hey, look, these women made this decision on their own. Because at one point it got very awkward on Friday. It was on Friday, where during the cross-examination, Agnifilo, the defense attorney for Raniere, is talking to the woman and saying, hey, you didn't have to stay in the room. You could have left the room. And she's like, no, I couldn't. And she's explaining all the reasons why. And I don't know that went real well for the defense. There was an emotional explanation of how she left the room the day before, of how she eventually, after her mother leaves the room, she runs out, she confronts Raniere on the court. And what's become a recurring theme here is Keith Raniere being described as someone who doesn't want to fight the fight when he's put in the spot. She runs into.
Not a fan of confrontation.
No, and she ran in to confront him, and she said he ran into the back of the crowd. And it's similar to what Lauren Salzman had said, that when the officers in Mexico came to arrest him, he was in a closet and was not saying anything. So after that, she was basically brought back to the house, and at that point they decided to let her go to Mexico. But I think he's got his work cut out for him. You never know what a jury's thinking, but this is a lot of testimony. Just one part of the testimony last week, it just comes out at a random part that this woman had fallen asleep on his couch on Flintlock.
Yeah.
And he, according to her testimony, came in, dropped his pants, and subjected her to
imposed himself.
Correct, to unwanted sexual contact. Right. And I think What's interesting too is, when you look at these homes where the people used to live, I knocked on all 3 doors of Flintlock, and the homes where people were said to have been in NXIVM who still are there, and nobody answered.
Right.
Nobody picks up. So, are they still there? It remains to be seen. But certainly people in the community of Knox Woods seem to be under the impression that NXIVM still maintains a presence, even though Keith Raniere, we know, is no longer there.
Right. Well, Rob, thanks a lot for taking the time. We appreciate it. Thanks again for all the good work these weeks. These are marathon efforts, and I'm sure your lovely wife misses you, but we're grateful for all the good journalism. Thanks. All right, you've been listening to NXIVM on Trial. We will be back with a new episode next week. I'd like to thank Jeff Anderson and Associates for supporting the Times-Union's coverage of the NXIVM trial. I would like to thank very much David Lombardo, our podcast whisperer. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you will enjoy his now completed Tales from the Coup series, part of the Capcom podcast. That's available wherever you get your Audible listening.